So I was part of a session that was actually a joint session between ESMO and the American Society of Clinical Oncology, or ASCO. And I was one of several speakers and panelists speaking about this topic of real-world data and real-world evidence. So the first thing I'll say is that real-world data is not new. It's actually been around for a long, long time. And my presentation took people all the way back to about 1600 BC to start with. So about 3,000 years ago or more is the first recorded real-world data. It was the ancient Egyptians who first recorded case reports on papyrus. So from there, we come all the way back to the present, and really what's changed in the last 50 years, and certainly the last 10 years, is the more ubiquitous use of electronic medical records. So now we have the data we've always had, but it's now computable, and you can actually do something with it. So what can you do? That's the real question. And what limitations do you have to think about when you're using this real-world data, which is created in the course of standard clinical care? I'll say that there were four main points I touched upon when you think about using real-world data generated in the clinic. It's not the only place where real-world data gets generated, but for the purposes of most discussions about real-world data, that's what we're talking about, data that's generated in clinics, in hospitals, in healthcare settings. So the first point that I talk about is accuracy. So is the data that you're seeing in the record correct? Or is it actually potentially misleading? And an example of that are billing codes. Billing codes are used like what they are saying. They're used to justify billing. They're used to ask for reimbursement from insurers. They're not the same as saying that a patient has that diagnosis. And in fact, they're often misused to test for a diagnosis that actually doesn't pan out to be the true diagnosis. And this is true for cancer diagnoses, but especially when you start looking at things like comorbidities, trying to understand the more full picture of a patient, you really have to be cautious when using something like that because of accuracy. The second topic that I addressed was completeness. Is there missing data? And this is often the biggest problem with real-world data. At a minimum, only a certain amount of data needs to be recorded to justify billing or to ensure continuity of clinical care, and it's often not the data that you might want when you're trying to evaluate the efficacy or effectiveness of a particular drug in a setting that's outside of a trial. And there's another important thing to think about when you think about missingness, which is it just missing at random, or is it missing not at random? And it's often the latter, and statistically speaking, it's much harder to adjust for that kind of missingness because you can't use standard imputation techniques in the same way that you normally would. So there's a lot of complications there. The other two items that I talked about were access to data. So there's all this data in the health record. Some of it is accessible and some of it is locked away still. One of the most obvious example of locked data is scans, PDFs, things that are not amenable to taking that information and doing something with it. But it goes way beyond that. Because of ethical and other considerations, it's often the case that it's really hard to bring together data from multiple institutions. And that's often necessary when you're looking at something like a rare population, where the whole point of using the real-world data is to find one or two cases at each of 50 or 100 institutions, put it together, and then do something with it. And access is everything in that case. And then the last thing I talked about was model transparency. So to do anything with real-world data, you've got to create a model of the world. You have to say, okay, this particular data element means the diagnosis, this one is a lab value. As soon as you start making those definitions, you're creating a model. And the problem with a lot of real-world data studies is that their models are not transparent. You can't reproduce what they did, so there's a whole issue with rigor and reproducibility if the models are not as transparent as they need to be. So, there are a number of communities that are working towards making very transparent models. One of the ones I spoke about is called Odyssey. They create something called the OMOP Common Data Model, and that is being used in a lot of locations now. If your model's fully transparent, actually the data access issue goes away, and you can actually do analysis in what's called a federated fashion. you bring the model, or you bring the model to the data as opposed to bringing the data to the model. And that is one potential solution going forward, since access remains really the biggest bottleneck for using real-world data.